Hey, Peter, what's happening? I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday.
I got inlining, CSS inline working with FastBoot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's a mess. I have a bone to pick with
Wait.
with the Google developers.
Okay. Here, let's start from the Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead. Let's start from the beginning.
I think they talk a lot of game and you know, a lot of best practices, and their open source tools, they're like good spikes. They're really good spikes, and they're freaking amazing what they can do. But they don't close that gap.
Yeah.
So I didn't ship this to production. I also learned a lot about what inlining CSS is and what critical CSS is. So this idea is that you're not taking all the classes on the page and putting their CSS rules into the head. Instead, the critical CSS is just what's rendered in the viewport. But
So you have a really long page, but you only actually care about what's above the fold.
what's above the fold. But
That's called critical.
That's called critical CSS. This is like, it's way easier said than done, because first of all, you're serving your HTML content for different devices. Yeah. So you can't just say the viewport is X. And the other thing is, if you have CSS definitions for elements that are below the fold, it could still affect the page. Like just I don't really have like a good like go-to hello world example here, but like when every website we work on,
maybe the scroll bar could flash because the content actually reflows the document once the height rule is applied.
Exactly. So there's not just saying like load critical CSS and inline it. It's not.
It does feel like the MVP here though is just get it for the whole page.
That's exactly what I think. But these tools that are preached on high down to us don't do that. They're very much
they're about analyzing the viewport.
Yeah.
Interesting.
They're impressive. They use originally they used like Phantom, but now they use Puppeteer, which is an API to Chromium. Yeah. So you install them and you're installing Puppeteer, and it's kind of cool that you're taking a document from FastBoot, sending it to Puppeteer.
Oh, wow.
Puppeteer is analyzing it.
No user involved ever.
Yeah.
Machine, render this HTML.
There was like a ticket. Like I couldn't get, our page isn't that tall. Our page is probably like 3,000. Okay. 3,000 or 2,000 pixels. Yeah, probably like somewhere between there.
Yep.
And I couldn't get, when I would set it to 3,000, I was half the CSS just wasn't included. Like even like the header CSS wasn't included. I found like an issue on GitHub that's like, you tell this thing that's calling out to Puppeteer to set the height to like 99999. It's like a magic number that just happens to work. Just like, so this is what I mean, where it's like, really good spike, but there's a lot.
Yeah. The way it's talked about and the reality of it.
The fact that there's like a lighthouse thing that's telling you to do this, and then it's I think you end up introducing, like, you get this inline CSS, but you introduce a whole bunch of other problems. So you now have like Puppeteer in your stack. If you have dynamic pages, you're using this at runtime. There's another thing.
It's like the just use the platform stuff.
Yeah.
And what does that actually mean? It means
they're good
new dependencies and
and they're good spikes and they make sense, but they are not close to production ready.
Yeah.
There's like other things where it's like the way when you still want to load your CSS, so you inline your critical styles, but then you still load the rest of the app CSS. You can think about like why this makes a ton of sense for an Ember app, because we don't need it for the initial paint. We only need the critical CSS. But then once you start clicking around, we want all the CSS loaded in the browser, so when we render a new route, everything just looks right.
Right.
The way this works is like there's like JavaScript that's actually changing your link tags. It's like the recommended best practice.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you load the CSS with a link tag, and you do like rel preload, and that tells the browser not to block it. It doesn't know that it's a style sheet. And then there's an onload event that happens with that link tag. And once the onload event fires, you switch it from like this rel preload to rel style sheet or whatever.
And that's the full app style sheet.
It's a full, whatever. I mean,
the normal
style sheet.
Style sheet that gets generated.
Yeah. So in an Ember app, this would be both.
You're saying it doesn't block. You don't want it to block because
you've already
have the inlined critical CSS.
But this is weird that you're now there's a lot going on your page on initial load, especially with like FastBoot. You're clearing away the DOM, you're re-rendering the DOM. You also have this like JavaScript that's inserted on your page that's
outside of your Ember app.
Ember app that's like changing these attributes on these link tags, and it's just, again, good spike, but there's just all these. It makes a problem. It makes a problem. What is like accidental complexity?
Incidental versus accidental complexity.
Yeah. So you have
essential versus incidental. Yeah.
So you have all this complexity that you're introducing, and I'm wondering if it's worth it. Like, is it worth it for? You can definitely see that the page is faster.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, even these CSS. Well, first of all, these style sheets get cached, so for repeat visits, they're not faster. But for cold, you can see it. Because you can see that point where it renders and the critical CSS is displayed, and then the other CSS takes over. That was another thing. Testing this was really hard. Because you can't like just inspect the critical CSS. The critical CSS renders, then your normal CSS comes in, and this all happens in the span of like 100 milliseconds. So you need a way to like, how do you block the real CSS from loading? And there's no, you can like use like a man in the middle proxy. That's what I did. I like set up Express to block. To like look for things and look for requests that ended in .css and just return an empty file.
Didn't you, as part of your FastBoot testing, stop the Ember app from loading?
Sure, I can stop the Ember app from loading, but that doesn't stop the CSS from loading. CSS.
But wait, how did you stop the Ember app from loading? You used defer readiness?
Defer readiness.
You didn't stop the script tag.
What I do
You
now,
originally were going to like strip the script tag out.
So there's 3 ways you can do this. If you're rendering it in iframe, you can do like sandbox true, and that just won't run JavaScript. You can strip the script tag or defer readiness, or what I've been doing lately is just Chrome DevTools disable JavaScript. I think that's like kind of the click a checkbox, JavaScript stops running.
But if you were writing a test, you wouldn't be able to do that. Like when you write a test and you want it to just freeze on painting the FastBoot renders.
So I don't render. So when I write FastBoot tests, I only render the FastBoot body, which does not include the script tags.
So could you do something similar here where you only render the FastBoot body and the inline CSS, but you don't render the head or the...
Well, the inline CSS ends up in the head. Yeah. And this tool, I just give it an HTML file, and it gives me back a new HTML file. So I don't have like these tools. I don't have control over like. This is what I want. I would want a low-level tool where I can say, given this HTML file, give me all the pieces that I can use to build up critical CSS. Give me.
I mean, the test, you would want it to be high level, right? Essentially, you'd want to see. Here's the FastBoot page with the inline CSS. And here's what it looks like.
But I think you can only write that test if you have the small building blocks. If all you have is something that takes an HTML file and returns an HTML file, then you don't have control over that CSS. And there's not. Also, like the dev tools maybe could offer something that's like, I'm developing critical CSS right now. Don't load any external style sheets. Or if you see this. Because, again, they do that thing where they add the JavaScript and the preload that swaps out your link tag. So if they see that, you could put it in testing mode.
An attribute on the link itself or on the HTML link.
You could put it in testing mode, and that would prevent it would prevent the thing from actually taking over.
Interesting.
But, it's just not – it's kind of like
rough edges.
What we've been talking about with open source where it's like making your users successful. It's not – It's not there, and I expected more. I don't know why, because it's like...
Yeah, I think Google has a reputation of doing this.
Yeah, and their docs are great. The examples are great. But it was when it actually came to implementing,
they dropped the ball in some areas.
Yeah, it felt like a really good spike. Felt like an amazing spike.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just not... I mean, I didn't ship it.
Right.
So...
And you would have been able to.
Yeah,
I mean, the reason you didn't ship it is not because it's because of these things.
Yeah. It's I can't get it to render for a really large viewport. So it works up until...
And you can't just say render it for the biggest viewport and just do the whole page for now, and then we can...
So I've been playing with numbers. I did like 4,000 pixels. Yeah. It doesn't work. There's like some other things about, like you can give like a dimensions array and you can put in like magic numbers there.
Right.
Again, I think what I want here is I want to say if there is a class name, a class selector inside of a class attribute, I want you to inline that CSS. Yeah. I don't want you to be smart and figure out like, oh, this is in the media min width 768, so I don't want that.
Right. Totally. I mean, that would be huge for us because we don't even use purge CSS right now on Tailwind. So it would literally be probably like 1 or 2% of, even if we did naively the entire page.
Yeah. That's funny. That's probably why I notice it. That's probably why I'm saying you can see it, because our CSS file is so big.
Unoptimized.
Yeah. It's cool. I mean, it's cool.
It's very cool. So where would this functionality end up? Would this end up where if you were going to open source this? This would be a new package?
I would make this an Express middleware because you want it. Yeah, it would be a new package. It's an Express middleware, and you compose it with your other FastBoot Express middlewares. I would focus on...
Does it have anything to do with FastBoot?
No, but I would...
Does it exist?
There are a bunch of wrappers around these libraries, but again, everything is too high level. Everything is too high level. And the library itself, the middleware is, I don't know, 30 lines, and 15 of it is the options hash that you're passing to the...
I see. So the hard work is being taken care of by this library.
Yeah, it's just too high level. I want the lower level bits to build up to this.
That's cool, though.
Yeah.
Very cool.
I'm not convinced that critical CSS. I mean, there's probably people that have been thinking about this for a while. They could probably argue against this. I'm not convinced that critical CSS is
high yield.
I mean,
especially compared to just getting the server render stuff to begin with. I mean, that's insanely high yield.
Yeah. So just take all the CSS classes on the page.
Yeah.
And then maybe I think that critical CSS is not where you start. It feels like an optimization.
Yeah.
So if you have a page that is 20,000 pixels in height, then you can start to say, okay, we can get rid of 95% of this.
Right. But so you're saying critical CSS is not necessarily high yield, but what about inlining the pages?
Yes.
You do think that's worth it?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think you can be naive.
Yeah.
And I think when you add in things like Puppeteer and a Chrome runtime and viewport dimensions, you are making your problem space so large.
I see.
Where if you just said, take every CSS class that's on this page,
which because you have the rendered
because you have the HTML, and inline it. First of all, that's like conceptually that's really simple, and then from there you can optimize. Like everything else we get to, we can optimize. So I would like something that's at that low level,
right?
And our footer classes will be inlined in the head, even though you never see the footer when you load the page,
right?
But that's
that's
just, what is that? It's like 4 classes.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So about the open source product stuff, we've been thinking about this last month or so. We've been watching this Q&A that Jason Fried, the co-founder of Basecamp, posted at Laracon this year. Laracon had awesome guest lineup. They had Ryan Holiday, Uncle Bob.
The Ryan Holiday talk was awesome.
Yes. Never thought I'd say I wish I was at a PHP programmer conference in 2018, but there you go.
Yeah, you told me that 2 years ago.
Yeah, Jason Fried talks about their new book. It doesn't have to be crazy at work, although it's kind of a different angle. It's really more for the programmer crowd there. And the part that we found most interesting was this discussion about scope and what scoping down means. I thought this was relevant for Ember stuff because there's a lot of times where being in a community like ours that's driven a lot by community contributions, sometimes you see people like looking for help with their open source projects, and they're like, oh, find someone who's motivated to help. All right, oh, this person's motivated, like, what, we better make use of them while we have them. Like, we only have this one opportunity, like, they're opening an issue or they're excited to help, like, let's make sure we empower them immediately. And like, that doesn't feel like a very...
I mean, you would never run a business like
Right.
that. You wouldn't be like, I'm going to hire a programmer. Oh, I've only got him for 3 months.
Right.
It's like, wow, how awful is...
Right. You're not going to be able to accomplish what you
Right.
think what you really... It seems like if you have taken on too many problems such that you're grasping for programming resources just to move the needle a tiny bit on these things, that you're doing too much. Basically, you don't have the resources to actually do what you think you do. And the answer is to take on smaller stuff. So we talked about making sure that we practice what we preach, and making sure we don't take on too much stuff, which of course is the hard part of all this.
It is so easy. It is so easy to just say yes to everything.
Yeah, it really is. So one idea I had was we want to actually, there's this other principle that we like, that we learned maybe this year, second half of the year, and started putting into practice with our board over here, where we measure how many videos we post every week, and a podcast that we do every week, and emails that we send every 2 weeks, and then tweeting out some useful information. And once we put it up on the board, and like you come in and you see the checkbox every day, there's something about that's very powerful. There's a lot of talk in like these habit forming books about making your environment such that it's easy to do the right thing. And there's also this phrase, you manage what you measure. So that really gets at this. So how can we measure this open source project scope creep stuff? And one idea I had was, if we get a page on our website where we show, kind of display our open source projects, Mirage, Tailwind, FastBoot testing, Storefront, are I guess the big ones. What would you want to see there that's going to set it up in such a way that when we see it, we want to be proud of that work, we want to make sure we're communicating, and also understanding that, accepting the fact and building into our process the fact that there's always going to be people asking for more work. And so our responsibility is to be able to say no and prioritize, and say, when we do say yes, communicate what is being said yes to. And so you can imagine showing like untriaged issue count. If you had this page where you have all of our projects, how many untriaged issues are there and how many open bugs? A bug being basically something that's like, basically if you have a bug, it means like I think I've come to believe that you should be committed to fixing all bugs in your open source project, because a bug is like a commitment. If you put a feature out or a way this thing works, then the way a programmer or user would expect it to work means that there's no bugs. And so if there's a bug, it's not working as expected. So like in add-on docs, if someone add-on docs is another one that we work on. If add-on docs, someone wanted to theme it, it's not a bug that it's not themable because I haven't committed to making it themable. But once you make it themable, you're committing to supporting that problem space. And there's always going to be things that you don't know that come up. So first it's like, oh, well, first we supply a single value, like a single theme color that affects parts of the page. But now that it's themable, like maybe there's something you hadn't thought of, like maybe the theme's global styles are leaking into your component styles. And so like it actually, even though you hadn't thought about this when you decided to support this feature, this actually is a bug. And if it's going to be themable, you have to fix that problem. And so that's why I think bugs are important to surface.
Do you see this as a way to force you to say no to feature requests? Because in the back of your head, it's I don't know what bugs are going to come up from theming, but I know there's going to be bugs, and I'm not going to have time to fix them, so I have to say no to this.
I think that's you need to be able to say that for sure. And similar to your Google experience, I think a lot of times, most times it is better. Well, okay, so I was going to say most times it's better to not launch a feature until you can make sure that you can commit to having no bugs. And so you can imagine this is where the scope thing comes into play as well, because it's not just do we support theming or do we not support theming. That paints it as a mutually exclusive dichotomy where we either go all in or not, and it's completely ignoring all the trade-offs that go in with how we could actually support this feature. And so this is where the scoping down comes in. So if we want to support theming, well, what are the user's problems we're really trying to solve? And so maybe it's, I want to make the style guide look like my company. Maybe I want to change the color. And you can imagine way different ways to tackle all those things that have various levels of like out of the box kind of Apple-like experience, where if you could snap your fingers and you like change a theme and no one runs into any bugs, but the reality is it doesn't. So instead what you do is expose like renderless components that's going to make more work for them to theme it, but actually makes it less work for you as a maintainer. And part of that is, again, it's not about having less work as a maintainer, because we talked about this last week, where you get to actually commit and you've actually supporting these features.
Ember Power Calendar does a great job at this. They give you some SAS functions, and you can just go bananas on CSS.
And he's not responsible for when you go crazy.
And you can. I mean, you can.
Yep.
There's not a theming system built into it. You get a bunch of functions, and you can do all the CSS.
Yep.
So I think that's a good, it's like acknowledging the trade-off and the snap your fingers perfect experience and what can be supported. So cool.
Yeah. So I think we want to try to work towards that with our own stuff. And if there's been bugs open in Mirage for 2 years, then the reality is those features don't work as advertised. And so you either need to fix those features or remove them from the project. And maybe there's a lower level thing you can expose for people who really need those features, but they're going to have it in a less ergonomic way, but they're not going to run into the frustrating bugs that you can't support.
So you're talking about, when you're talking about scoping down here, you're talking about kind of as the project is being developed, kind of like taking its temperature, checking its water level, seeing where it's at, and then deciding how to scope down.
Yeah, I think it's a rolling process because it's based on what requests come up, and you're going to know different things are needed once people are really using it. Once people start using Tailwind, do they really want a customizable style guide, or what they really want is like purge CSS?
So how do you build that? How do you build that rolling process like into your OSS workflow? Because the projects that I've worked on, there's basically 2 times when it gets scoped down. It's at the beginning of the project. They're like, hey, we want to rewrite our accounting system. We want to redo all this. And there's someone that's like, okay, I need to like cut half the features or this thing's never going to get done. So it's the beginning of the project, or it's like the end of the project. It's coming up on a deadline. We're not going to ship. It's like emergency meeting, scope down meeting, but it's never happening.
Well, that was what's so powerful about Jason Fried's 6-week rolling deadline at Basecamp, and how everything falls into that. And then you have a 2-week period where you step back and think about what the next focus is going to be. And the 6-week deadline forces you to do that. So it's arbitrary, but it's an arbitrary forcing function. You say our goal this month is to polish up our site and show off our open source, and double down on committing to the open source we have. So we're going to do that by exposing the number of untriaged issues and bugs. We're going to close old bugs. We're going to say no to new features. We're going to launch a 1.0. And in that talk, he talks about how there's many milestones, and what you get done in that 6-week rolling period may change, but you end up scoping down. I mean, that is the answer. You scope down to achieve a certain goal. And then if that goal is still looming and still the number one thing in the next cycle, you do it again. But you have this arbitrary point that forces you to scope down and treat it like you have a real deadline. Otherwise, it just becomes unbounded work, and you just don't scope down ever, which is a problem because you're not getting feedback. You're not moving on. You're not iterating. So
what is the end of the 6 weeks look like? Is there a big deployment and a retro?
I heard him say they don't do retros, which I thought was interesting. I was just listening to this Bike Shed podcast from the Thoughtbot, and they were talking about how they do retros at Thoughtbot and how they really like them. They only like them if there's action items that come out of them. If it's just like a grieving session, then it's not good. You can imagine that, especially if you're on like a crazy consulting project.
Those are beer retros.
Yeah, exactly. The real retros that happen, the bars. But should be action items that are takeaways, and your process changes as a result. So you identify the things that were wrong with your process, or were good with your process, and you adjust the process as a result. But I think Jason was saying that they don't do retros, and because they're just like, well, we don't care. Like for us, success means we built the thing because either we wanted it. That's what he said. Like if we built something because we wanted it, which we do often, then success is, do we use it in the next month or two? Are we actually using this new feature, a hill chart, let's say? If a client has been asking for recurring meetings, which was his other example, for years, and customer support keeps reminding us of that, which they do, then success is just building that, and now we have that. And so now they can use it. And like, of course, the customer support people will gather feedback on how useful it is, and maybe they'll adjust it in a future sprint or iteration cycle, but they're not going to do a retro, I think. So they're a little more loose. And again, he says this several times in the talk that this is what works for them, and he's not saying that every company should work this way, but he does think every company should. There are certain things that he thinks apply to every company, but these specific things were more like particular. But I do like, we just have not understood the scoping down thing and not practice it a lot. And I see a lot of people who don't either.
But the trick here, like, you're convinced that it's 6 weeks or some
No,
time
I'm convinced.
Period.
I'm not even convinced about that yet because we haven't really even tried that yet, so I don't really know. I'm just convinced that if you're in a spot where you feel like you have 5 or 6 things going on and you're desperately grabbing for resources to help move the needle there, then you're not focused enough. And I see a lot of people like that. It's a spike, right? It's a spike that turned into a thing that wasn't ever finished. And you can argue that people get value from a spike, and they know they have to get their hands dirty and open the source code, and like they do that, and that's fine. I think if you have the right understanding of the product side, you can make that the product and just be honest about it, and people will have. It's just like the FastBoot stuff, right? If FastBoot was marketed differently as a low-level thing instead of a one command install that just works, that would be fine. Maybe the code would be exactly the same as what it is today. It would completely alter your experience with it. So I think that for me, that is the key part of it, which I think we still have a long way to go to understand.
Nice.
What that means, what that looks like in all of these projects. So we were talking about Ember Octane and talking about changes to the projects every year and how to market those. And I think this applies here. Like, Apple cut scope when they didn't launch the iPad in the last event. That's cutting scope as a function of a deadline. And this is another point that you made, which was good, which was like, sometimes we talk about we're going to build this feature or add this thing to the site or whatever, and we just say this is the most important thing, and we do it. And we didn't consider the budget of time. And that was the Jason Fried Q&A made us think, like, even though 6 weeks is arbitrary, it imposes a budget constraint. And you never think about your finances without a budget. And this is the same thing. Like, you can't just say, this is the most important thing to add this feature, and I'm just going to work on it until it's done. Because what if it took 10 years? Well, then it's obviously not the most important feature anymore. It's a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, and how often does this happen in code?
Yeah.
Where it just thing goes
blossoms.
On forever and ever and ever. Yeah.
All the time.
This is why,
you can work on one thing for a year, a rendering engine.
Yeah.
Or something that's like, you don't realize it. So then you say, like, okay, suspense has been worked on for a long time in React, and people are like, when are we going to get this? And for them, they know, even though this has taken, 2 or 3 or 4 times as long, it's still the most important thing. So they're saying no to a lot of things, but they're not going to launch it until it's done. But you can. So there's obviously times where you, as like the owner of the product, have to weigh in and say, listen, I'm going my gut here. This is the most important thing, and we're going to keep throwing resources at this until it gets done.
It's exactly like how you would manage a budget. You could eat up all your money, but you could still say, like, okay, I need more. I'm going to find a way to get more.
Right.
Or you could say, okay, it's done.
Right.
Ship it. I think the powerful thing about the budget is it forces you up front to think about all these things. Right? If I was going to redo my kitchen, when I start that process of thinking about what that means to redo my kitchen, I'm going to be considering like, what do I get for this amount of money? What do I get for that amount of money?
And you have a ballpark in your head of what the budget actually is to start. Do we have 10K? Do we have 80K?
Right.
And that's going to totally affect the decisions you make.
Totally. Maybe you can stretch it a little. Maybe you can spend a little less.
Right.
But yeah, it's something that you think about up front. So it's right there at the beginning. So that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the like 6-week thing, whatever it is.
Or whatever it is for us, 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something. Because usually it's like, oh, right. Yeah, Mirage needs to run in the server. Okay, let's start working on it.
Yeah. Or like me with FastBoot, like like the CSS stuff I was talking about. It's just, that stuff is just never ever ending. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. I think it would, we talked about if we do have this where we get on embermap.com/open source or something, and it shows, issues and bugs as a way to keep us in check and just surface these things. You could imagine that tool being like useful for other people. And you were talking about like how it could also be useful. I mean, the lessons apply to product teams too. Are there features that are half implemented in your product that are buggy? If you were to go to a team like some of our old teams, and you ask them like, are there bugs? Are there things that like bugs that have been outstanding for years? Would there be people on your team who are frustrated because there's something that hasn't ever been worked on in 2 years, and someone on your team, maybe like a designer, thought like, why isn't this done? And like, it's just been sitting here, it's a bug, or the way we implemented login isn't actually like right. Mm-hmm. It's not good. Like it was only half implemented. What people say, like this thing was half implemented and shipped. That's all related to this discussion of scoping down and having everyone on the team on the same page about what are the trade-offs involved with how we're building this, and when we decide to not make it. So with the recurrence thing that Jason was talking about in Basecamp, they made it so when you set up a recurring calendar event, it doesn't get added as a recurring calendar event to like your iCal or your iPhone. You actually just get the first week, and I think like every time you open it, you get one, whereas you would expect to get it every week. And he was like, that sucked. Like to ship that, it sucked. Like ideally, if it's a recurring thing and like iCal or Google Calendar has support for recurring events, you would see like this repeats every week until October 30th or whatever. And he was like, we just couldn't do that within 6 weeks, so we didn't do it.
So what happens there? You get to the end of the 6 weeks and you're like, we can't ship this?
I think they realized early on, or they weren't necessarily going to build it like that from the beginning. They realized that was another goalpost that they might hit, but they couldn't do that within the 6 weeks. So they had to make a trade-off. That is the trade-off that they had to make, and say, yeah, either we ship this and it sends out a single day notification for people, or we don't ship this at all. And so that was the trade-off they made.
That's awesome. That's so awesome that you're having that discussion at the beginning.
Yes.
And not you get there and you get moved on to a new project.
Yeah.
And now you have this half implemented feature.
Or you say, this is actually going to take another 3 months or whatever.
And it takes another 3 months.
Yeah.
Really 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So he was like, that sucked, but that let us draw that line in the sand, and then we can say, okay, reset on the margin. What's the most valuable thing we can do next? Maybe it's adding this thing to the recurring thing, but maybe there's this other thing and now all of those support requests that were coming in asking us for recurring events, now those are going to go from 100 down to 15, who are going to be 15 people going to be saying, can I get this as a recurring event in our calendar? And so now it's maybe not the highest priority thing anymore.
Nice.
But he was like, it sucks to do that. Obviously, if you could snap your fingers and software was cheap and easy, like you would build it as the best way possible, quote best. But given that the trade-offs have to be made and are made, you want everyone on the team to acknowledge that and to understand why it was made that way, so you don't have people saying like, yeah, we really botched this. Like, we shipped this 2 years ago and it's just like this half implemented thing that I'm not proud of. Like, you can be proud of it, it's just a smaller scope of work. So I think that's the balance you want to get to. You never want to ship something that you're not proud of. And sometimes that's going to mean taking on a smaller chunk of the problem space.
Nice. Okay, so say you're in a spot, you have 5 open source projects. There's tons of issues. You're not proud of them. I mean, yeah, just that, like, inside you're not proud of them. You get this dashboard set up.
Yep.
What information is that dashboard going to tell you? Like, is that dashboard just going to stress you out because now there's...
To me, I think 70 untriaged issues stresses me out, and it makes me feel overwhelmed. Like I have no idea where to start. Whereas a dashboard that helps you pick apart the 15 to 20% of things that are bugs and the rest that are feature requests immediately lets you ignore the feature requests because the bugs are more important because they're a signal, they're a commitment to the things that you have committed to support, the functionality you've committed to support. And now that you can focus on the 15 to 20% of things that are bugs, you can get to them. And honestly, bugs are way easier to tackle typically than feature requests because feature requests can be unbounded if you don't think about them right. You're basically solving other people's problems and you're generalizing your library when you add features, which just makes it way harder than the reason you open sourced it in the first place was that it solved your problem. So that's, like we were talking about last week with Redux being done, a big part of it is like, this thing solves my problem. I'm going to commit to generalizing it to some degree, but not to a complete degree. And this is going to help me decide when to stop and say, this is the complete generalized solution that I'm willing to support, that I have the resources to support, and from beyond that, you're on your own. And so the bugs are typically easier to fix and work through. You just need to go through them and do it. And you can write tests for them, and you can check them off, and you can say now, you feel way better when you have no bugs because then you know everything that's in your docs and all the features that you support actually should work. And if a bug comes up, it's actually an unexpected thing that you can be able to tackle right away. And so once you finish your bugs, then you can just draw a line and say, you could stop right there.
Nice. The project's done.
The project could be done.
What if, okay, so I just want to throw curveballs. What if, like, this is good for, like, you and I?
Yep.
Because we're in agreement. What if you're in a big open source project and there's many different contributors and someone comes and they're like, I want to work on this new feature. I want to add this new feature.
Yeah.
Like, you as a maintainer, how do you address that?
Well, we had this in add-on docs where someone wanted to add API docs as a separate section, which we do want to do eventually instead of having them bundled together with the guides on one page. But the person basically implemented it and showed that it worked and showed that it was actually like easier from the user's perspective. Like they only had to change these 5 lines or whatever. And they were motivated. And the thing is, you have to understand. And I think Chris is good about understanding this. I think about this a lot. And so you have to understand that even if you're motivated to fix that, it's like giving the maintainer a puppy. It's free as in puppy, the feature that you've just added to their library. And so I think someone who's been around the block before understands that. And so even though there's a great new feature here packed up in a PR with tests, you're not going to just click that merge button because you understand now that we support ABI docs on a separate page, there's things that we don't know. There's things that we don't know that we don't know. And there's just a lot of discussion that has to happen before you add something like that to a project like that. So we basically just talked through that, and that's going to be like, that might be closed for now, and it's not like that code is gone. Once we decide and finish the bugs and then decide that that's the next most important feature to work on, we might reference that. We might use that implementation once we've thought through the problem. But basically, like, I think to answer your question did you have something to say, or?
Just to go a little deeper like that, I can see there's like 2 ends of a spectrum. Like one end is like, great, thanks for writing this code. Other people can use it.
Yep.
I'm going to merge it and not maintain it. And you kind of outlined, it's a puppy, why that's bad.
Yeah.
At the other end, you could just say like, sorry, we can't support this right now. Like how do you address that in a big open source project when you have many?
Well, first, I think you want to try to, it's always good to talk to someone ahead of time before they spend time on implementation, because you can help avoid them doing wasted work. Second, I think it's the same conversations that a product team should have, which is how can we solve this problem in different ways? What are the trade-offs we can make? There's 100 different ways we could tackle this, and this is one of them. And again, this is where I would think about some low-level thing that is easier for us to support, that we actually can commit given the resources we have for this project. I mean, the project is already overextended based on, like, we did spike at the beginning, all these cool features that are now revealing the edge cases that are hard to maintain. So I think something like API docs as a separate page, maybe like right now the API docs, the auto-generate API docs are automatically rendered in the nav as part of the docs viewer component. So maybe instead of making what he did, which was like they automatically generate in a different thing, and then there's like a config option, maybe there's a way to just disable that. And maybe we show you how we built it within our component, and it's like a renderless component. And now you can just go to town with that if you want. That's a lower level thing that's not going to try to support all these different use cases out of the box. But if you want to go to town with the lower level stuff, you can.
I see. So you use these low level primitives to build up
high level things that we can commit to supporting.
And then you can also expose those as like public API for others
exactly.
to use.
It's the Mirage Pretender thing, basically. So I can't commit to supporting pagination in a way that's going to make every Mirage user happy. So just write it yourself using a Pretender route handler.
Nice.
So I think but I think it is your job as maintainer to communicate that and to think. It's hard to think through that sometimes, to think how can we do that. It's a storefront case. Like, there's probably a lower level thing we could just expose in storefront that puts a little bit more burden on the consumers, but doesn't have all these weird edge cases. My API looks like this, and now load all doesn't work.
Yep.
So I think that's the answer. And that is a form of scoping down, right? Because the snap your fingers, you want to just support all the use cases out of the box. Obviously, it's a better user experience, but you have to scope down because you can't support all those things out of the box.
And also, like we talked about last week, I mean, in Ember, you want to be the conventional, non-configurable solution.
Right.
So you have that working against you.
Right.
But as we talked about, as you pointed out, they're not
necessarily, you can have conventions while still exposing the lower level stuff. And when you take on something really big like Ember and Ember CLI, where it's like, we really don't have consistent resources that we can deploy towards these things, and we really do have to just take advantage of like people who are motivated when they're motivated. Maybe the answer there is like Ember is too big. And again, that's part of what we've heard. And it's like, if we move it into smaller things, it becomes easier to pick off. And also you can say no to problem spaces like FastBoot or engines, potentially, or scope those down. And it's easier to scope those down if they're separate from the rest of Ember. So you can imagine Ember CLI the same way. Like, you could imagine like all the high level stuff that we use, but you could imagine like less of the high level stuff and like a few smaller rationalized primitives. Broccoli is a good rationalized primitive, but then there's a big gap between Broccoli and all the Ember CLI hooks. And you could imagine like maybe there's one of those things that really all of them implement, and then you can implement yourself, and it's like really well documented and really everyone understands it, as opposed to right now where it's a lot of it is there's a big jump and it's a lot of high level stuff.
Okay, so given that, let's say you recognize one of those situations where it's like we bit off more than we can chew, and
time to fix the bugs.
Is there ever a point where it's like, can you ever not fix the bugs and say like, I need to provide a new lower level API because I bit off more than I can chew?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think you could remove a feature and say, we thought we could do theming, and it turned out way harder. So instead, we're not going to provide theming. We're just going to provide you with the building blocks that we use to make our theme, and basically you can just like not use any of that and just build up your own theme. So
seems really hard to do. Seems like a really hard. I know I would have trouble doing that.
About like saying no to people,
providing
stepping back,
providing an API that's in there, seeing that it's wrong, admitting that like, I know what the fix might be, but I cannot fix this.
Yeah.
And then also then removing that API. I mean, if you remove an API, I can imagine users just being upset.
Right.
You feel like you're
letting them
betraying
down.
Trust almost. That you're taking.
I don't think so. That's the thing. Like, put yourselves in the shoes of the user. If let's try to think of a good example.
Well, I can say one. FastBoot. I just ripped out all the FastBoot. So we are just using new FastBoot, and we're making all the calls to FastBoot directly.
Wouldn't you rather them have said with FastBoot App Server, this is an example, but it's an example implementation. It's not.
Of course, having gone through what I went through.
Yeah.
Yes. And if they said that now, I would be happy.
Yeah, you would respect them more.
I wouldn't feel like, man, you're taking an API away from me.
Yeah, if someone said, like, to be honest, y'all, this was way more than I thought, and based on what I know now, yeah, the problem space is a lot harder, so you would totally respect anyone who said that.
Yeah, it would make me more excited about...
Way more excited.
Yeah.
So it's hard saying this thing to say that.
It's still... It's hard to put myself in the other shoes. Like, to imagine that there's a problem that's not working. I'm going to remove an API.
Yeah.
It feels, I guess you're right though.
I
put
think
yourself in the shoes of the user.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think, again, Dan Abramov did this in some capacity when he said Redux is done and not going to solve everyone's problems, because all of the problems that are coming up as a result of people using Redux are exposing that this problem space is huge. I can't solve everyone's problems right now, and so we're going to go back to the drawing board and think about other things like suspense. But that's an effective...
but to me, that's different because he
knew ahead of time. Yeah,
yeah, he did
it right. In a sense.
Right. He got up to that level, and then he didn't go past it.
Well, he also said the thing about him regretting talking about it in terms of his API, which may have effectively communicated that it did more than it really did. So that's part of it. So he was in a sense, backtracking his communication about it.
That's a good point. Because maybe at the time when you're communicating the API, you see the higher level features that could be built up to. And
so he maybe, knowing what he knows now, he would have talked about it, introduced it differently. I'm sure he would say that. I'm sure he would say that because he's learned so much.
I mean, he did say that.
He literally said that. Yeah, exactly. That's what he said. So yeah, I think no, it's just what we've talked about before. It happens with companies, like stringing people along, not giving them a definite yes or no. People would much rather hear no. People can deal with yeses and nos. They can't deal with surprises.
When this podcast started, I didn't really know how the open source and the company stuff would connect, but now I see it. I mean, now as you've been talking through it, I see it. So it's
the yeses and nos and the clear communication and the expectation setting.
Yeah, and like the half done,
right,
and half implemented,
right,
and wasn't built right,
right.
And you can see all that stuff in open source as well. And what is the problem there? The problem wasn't that it was built wrong. It's too big. Need no scoping down.
No scoping down. Yep. So I am a big believer in the power of tools to help expose this stuff. And so I am excited thinking about a tool that could help bring this stuff. Just like the Trello board fosters communication with product teams and engineers about having only one thing you can work on at a time, what the prioritization is. I do think there's a tool that could exist that could talk about this, scoping down, acknowledging that building a thing there's 100 different ways to do it. So
budget trade-offs.
Yeah, budget, exactly, budgeting.
I have one more question. It's gonna be like the Ryan closer. The Ryan asks all these scope down questions. You can tell I don't like scoping down. What are there some things, like some open source tools, some products that can't be scoped down? It's scoping it down would ruin the experience of the product, where you need to provide these high level features, and if you can't, it's a product failure, not a scope failure.
Basically, the MVP is
exactly. So MVP
is huge.
I think that oftentimes you can scope down software. I don't think you can scope down an MVP, because if you can scope down an MVP,
by definition, the thing wasn't an MVP.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that, but I just made that joke, but I am a fan of scoping down.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if there are certain things that can't be scoped down.
But this is where I think Jason would say, based on his Q&A, would say you can always scope things down, and budget scope is actually a function of constraints like a budget. And if you aren't used to practicing within constraints like that, you tend to think in this way that, no, we have to get this layer working like this. And it turns out actually it's not an independent variable. It's not an externally independent variable. It actually depends on other things like acknowledging competing priorities, right? It's not the scope. This thing is not given on high, and it's just like, it's going to take X resource. He's like, there's always ways to scope it down. The recurrence events might be a good example where you think like you literally couldn't ship that without the recurring integration, but it turns out you can. And maybe you wouldn't think about that if you weren't in the habit of practicing within the constraint of a budget. So,
that's good. Yeah.
So I think maybe there's an exception, but I think he was like, you can always scope it down. Also, like
something like, okay, let's take Ember CLI for example. Couldn't you imagine that you scope that down to
broccoli transform or something?
Isn't this just Webpack? Isn't this just broccoli? Like, could you? I guess that's kind of what I was asking. Like, could you scope something down where it's?
I don't know, because like Ember CLI deploy did a good job of like defining a pipeline and basically don't give you anything other than just a very small set of conventions over like low level transforms. But that was a product, like that was an MVP.
Okay, and you could say that's just like any other middleware system, but
right.
But they did a good job defining the boundaries.
Yes, exactly. 5 steps that everyone uses, and so instead of implementing them for everyone, they just expose them. So,
you know how you brought up the example with add-on docs about using these low-level primitives to build the higher-level thing, and then when users want to use something, you tell them the low-level primitives, and they can go off and use it themselves. So pipelines and middlewares, I think, are an awesome way to provide that. So something like Ember CLI deploy, not building every single deploy situation.
Mirage, not adding pagination, instead just exposing middleware. You could even imagine a higher level thing on top of API. If the goal was to help people make conventional mock servers easier, instead of having to just build pagination and filtering and sorting middlewares, I just define a new, slightly higher level thing that lets people build those themselves and hook into it.
Yeah.
And, middleware style. So that's the thing. I think you get creative when you have deadlines and budgets. You make the trade-offs better, like, because they're right there in front of your face. Whereas if it's an unbounded problem, you're like, of course, add-on docs has to support theming, or even of course, add-on docs has to have an out-of-the-box great thing. Like, there's definitely an MVP there where you can just like import a module and you can loop over it yourself. It's just the auto-generate API docs, and it's just an import. There's no view layer at all. And now we can give you an example that you can copy paste to get started, but it's not an API we're supporting. It's just the import. It's just the module import.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. This is so great because again, as an Ember developer, my mind wants to go to
conventional,
the best conventional
high-level
solution. Yeah. It's just an Ember install away.
Yeah.
But I'm not considering
all the trade-offs, all the opportunity costs. You're not thinking about that, which is not good.
That's so true, because okay, maybe you can't just Ember install it, but it's pretty sick that you can import this thing.
Yeah.
Or like FastBoot, it's pretty freaking amazing.
Yeah.
That you can new FastBoot and then call .visit and get the HTML of your Ember app. It doesn't matter that there's no production server, that there's no middleware. Just that alone is pretty freaking amazing.
Right. And I get that you, in your head, have this idea that like one install command to get you the ideal API. But I think we shouldn't work from the. I think it's okay to think about the ideal API, but then to work back and say, given the true cost of that, what are some suboptimal APIs? But the suboptimal is worth the trade-off because you get so much of the cost back.
Yeah. What do I get for it? Yeah. What do I get for it?
Yeah. Exactly. So,
is it one of these things when when you've thought about this with Mirage or add-on docs, where it's like you think about these and you're like, oh, that's obviously the one. Like that one hits a sweet spot. It gets you what you need, and it doesn't cost a lot.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So you know it, like
I think so. Feeling. Yeah, and I think especially with things like the renderless components as a way to expose the data, you needed to build up something like an add-on docs with a dynamic thing, but giving you control over, because the theming stuff, people have already started theming add-on docs, and it's like it's super unfriendly too, because not only is there's no public API for it, we use the Tailwind classes, and so like overriding those is crazy. It's not what it's designed for, right? And right now we're just comfortable
so they could override like text red and make it color blue.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Exactly. So, it might actually be even better to, knowing that there's so much that we don't know about how people want to use it, to think about the lower level stuff, even if it would be a slightly suboptimal high level API, because the problem space is so unknown, and it's going to be used in so many different ways. It might have been better to come first at it with a renderless component instead of an out-of-the-box built thing. Because maybe for you getting started, you would still have a copy-paste thing that would get you going really quick. It just wouldn't be baked into the thing in a way, you know what I'm saying, at a little lower level. So
also too, like I look at, just look at me, an Ember developer. I love add-on docs. I love that it just works. If you showed me a bunch of renderless components that would give me like all the data and metadata for my add-on, I'd be like, this is the coolest thing in the world. You know what I mean? Like my excitement level is still just as high.
It means a little more work for you.
Yeah. It's not an out of the box. It's not an Ember install away, but I'm not going to be like, this sucks. I'm going to be like, this is so cool. Like I would get really excited over that.
And we already did this, actually. This was already a decision I did make at the beginning when I started, is that this is just going to be an Ember app. Now, if you're imagining this were being like a business and what is the ideal API here? It's actually way higher level than an Ember app, because an add-on docs app is a very constrained Ember app. So it actually, if I could snap my fingers, I would have something that looks more like Next.js or Read the Docs, where to add a page of docs to your site, you create a file under like pages, like a markdown file. That automatically adds the route. That automatically adds the table of contents. Right now, you have to define a new Ember route. You have to go back to your docs index and add the table of contents thing. And then you have to define a template, which you can do it as a markdown file. So there's a little bit of a higher level API there, but it's not. If I snap my fingers, it would be like a pages thing, or like docs with like different. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying, but again, as someone that's built like 3 sites and add-on docs now, if you like auto-generated my nav based on a bunch of markdown files in a folder, there'd be something.
You would hit something.
I would hit something. Yeah. There'd be something where I would say like, can we change this?
Exactly.
Having to open up the navigation template and adding in a new link to the page I just added, it's not that big of a deal.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that was a deliberate decision. Knowing that this wasn't going to be like a full-time job, and knowing that that was what you're talking about, where it's like a clear win there. Make this a conventional Ember app, so anyone can go to town on it when they need to, and they're not going to be boxed into a bad high-level abstraction. So that was a deliberate decision. I think when it comes to things like theming, I do think we're going to provide a simple way to change the color. It's a very high-level thing, but if we can also expose the lower-level things that we're using to build up the themes now, then we'll be able to handle all the people who want to go bananas with it themselves, while still having a nice high-level interface for just a few customization options. So I think, and that was from my experience. Like I knew that wanting to reach for something that was like so easy, adding a page and you get the drop down, like the navigation for free, but just knowing like I've been there before and I'm not going to do that again. So it's like, no, this is going to be an Ember app, and it's going to be a little more work for you, but that's fine. That's okay to make that trade-off. So I think now no matter what I do, it's going to be, especially with open source, that's just something. Another thing I've come to believe is like, if you are adding a high-level API, consider the fact that there's going to be things that you're not thinking of, and when folks are using this new high-level API, when they get boxed in, what is going to be there? Does it devolve into lower-level things that they can use to get out of it? So I think that's like a really important core principle of good OSS.
Seems like an awesome way to fight burnout as well.
Yeah,
just hearing you talk about this, like enabling people. Not coming up with a genius solution to enable people.
So much pressure on that. That's like the big reveal. And it's like why we don't do that with software development at all. Or like even design. Like I'm reading this book about design, and it's like, they're like, don't do a pitch, right? Don't wait, go heads down for 4 months and come and do this big presentation. That's not the wrong way to do it. You want to expose your process, weekly updates. So much pressure to try to get it right on that one go. And now it's like, look, we're adding a new thing, and then there's this lower level thing. And then there's you've hit another marker where you're quote done. You could just walk away from that project forever, but now you're not going to feel bad if someone runs into because they have the lower level thing, and so you don't have any pressure as maintainer.
Awesome.
Way better.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm excited for open source now.
Good. So we just got to close the loop on our buggy open source and make sure it doesn't ever get buggy again. But I think it'll be good to do this. I think we're going to do this, and I think it'll be good to like see how it works and set it as an example. Try to lead by example in the community, and just have other people see it. Like, you should never. And I do think this stuff will make its way into GitHub eventually, but it's just going to be a while. But like, you should never go to a project and ask like, you should just know how long has it been since the maintainers worked on this. What is the status of the open bugs, and like what does that mean? If there's a bug or if there's an untriaged issue, what does it mean? I think all that stuff could be standardized and exposed in a way that's like makes it very clear and helps people avoid burnout, because like you as a maintainer understand that you don't have unlimited resources to work on this stuff. And so there's a time where you can walk away from something. And what does it look like to walk away from a project in a good way?
Dude, what you just said there, it just bring it full circle back to the beginning of this conversation where I was talking about all these CSS tools.
Yeah.
Going to these libraries, seeing 80 issues. I don't know if that's 80 feature requests, 80 people having problems with this, 80 bugs. Like, so
it's so frustrating. That's so, and you wouldn't care if they said that.
No, of course
this is a huge problem. We haven't solved it all right now. It's because that is the reality of it. It's just that you have to find that out yourself. So I think a lot of this stuff is really like, these are hard learned lessons that people who have been doing open source longer know, but the tools could help people get there way faster with way less pain.
Yeah, cool.
So maybe we'll see those someday here soon.
So where can folks find us?
So we're going to wrap up this episode now. We are on EmberMap.com. We make videos for Ember developers, and we are also on YouTube. So can find some of our public free videos there, and we're on Twitter as well, Ember_map.
Nice. So, don't forget the underscore.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next time.